All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give us a few more seconds till people settle in and we can close the door to have the kind of conversation we're keen to begin today. A very important conversation. Thank you for having joined us. It's lovely to see so many faces tuning in. Great to have you here, and I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming this wonderful panel. We're going to be talking about how a new collective quantified goal can help unlock nationally determined contributions to phase out fossil fuels and help build a renewable energy future for all. I'm sure you're all optimistic about this as we're heading towards the end of COP29. So we're going to jump straight in. We have a 90-minute panel planned. So I might need to hurry some of our panelists along for time, but I'm hoping to keep some time at the end to take questions from our wonderful audience as well. So I'll start off with introductions. My name is Namra Chowdhary. I'm most commonly called Nama in the climate movement, and happy for any of you to refer to me as such as well. I am the head of public engagement at campaigning organization 350.org, and we are here to host this panel just to remind us all that we are now barreling towards the end of COP29, which is smack in the middle of the decisive decade, where we have to make decisions now to keep global heating to manageable levels. That's a given. I'm sure no one here has any doubt about that being needed right now. We want countries everywhere to have ambitious climate goals. That can really only happen if we agree to an NCQG as well. Now that we're at the halfway point in the climate decade, there is really no time left for us to waste. But we cannot expect ambitious climate goals of any countries, particularly not the climate vulnerable countries, without the finance for it being available. Climate vulnerable countries who are the least responsible for the climate crisis are the ones who are bearing the brunt of it, the worst of it. Rich countries know that they have a responsibility to pay to enable this just transition to renewable energies that we know is so desperately needed right now. And the time for it is now. As we develop a new climate finance goal, a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, it's important for us to look for ways, creative, innovative ways in which we can do this. One of the most obvious is to start taxing the super rich, but we'll leave it to the panel to explore some of these in greater detail. I'm going to start by introducing the panel, and each of them, our wonderful panelists, have a long and illustrious experience list. So bear with me and as I read this, just so I make sure I'm not missing any of the details. We have the pleasure of speaking with Kathy il-Kijiner, our climate envoy for the Marshall Islands. Kathy's work focuses on the delivery of the Marshall Islands National Adaptation Plan, launched last year. Thank you, Kathy, and supporting national policy and international advocacy. Her background is influenced by her work as a poet, a performance artist, and an educator, having co-founded the youth environmentalist nonprofit Joe Jikum. I hope I said that right, Kathy. Welcome. Welcome to the panel. On my side here is Laurie van der Burg from Oil Change International. Laurie is the Global Public Finance Co-Manager at OCI. Her work focuses on ensuring a just transition through moving governments and financial institutions away from continued financing and permitting the expansion of coal, oil, and gas. Previously, Laurie has worked at Friends of the Earth Netherlands, where she led the climate court case against Shell, filed on behalf of 17,000 people. Prior to that, Laurie has worked with the Overseas Development Institute as a climate and energy researcher, focusing on fossil fuel subsidies and energy access. She had her start in climate activism as a student, as many of us here have done, working on a fossil fuel divestment campaign with Students for Sustainability Amsterdam. Laurie holds an LLM in Environmental and Climate Change Law from the University of Edinburgh and a BSc in Liberal Arts and Sciences from Amsterdam University College. Welcome, Laurie. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Bill, if you'll wave a hand, we have Bill Hare from Climate Analytics. Bill is a physicist, a climate scientist, and CEO of the Global Science and Policy Institute, Climate Analytics. Bill has contributed to the development of the international climate regime since 1989. He was a lead author for the IPCC's fourth assessment report, led the influential series of the World Bank report Turn Down the Heat from 2013 to 2014, and is one of the leaders of the Climate Action Tracker. Bill has been described as the go-to climate advisor for the most climate vulnerable countries, particularly small island developing states and the least developed countries. Bill was recently appointed as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on non-state actor net zero commitments. Looking forward to hearing you later, Bill. And then we have Joseph Sikulu from the Pacific Climate Warriors and 350.org. Joseph, or Joe, as I'm more likely to refer to him, forgive me, Joe. Joe comes from Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga, and is one of many LGBTQIA+ First Nations people across the world who are fighting to protect home and country whilst struggling to deal with the place in Western world that was built to oppress them and continues to do so. Joe has worked over the last 10 years to build a movement of strong Pacific climate warriors across Pacific communities, both on islands and in the diaspora. He is a climate change campaigner and advocate, the managing director for 350.org Pacific, serves on the Secretariat for the Pacific Climate Warriors, and is a Pacific champion for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thank you, Joe, for being here, and we look forward to you as well. And last but not least, we have Yeb Sanyo from Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Yeb is the former chief climate negotiator of the Philippines and co-chair of the UNFCCC Long-Term Finance Work Program, and is now the executive director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. He leads the work of Greenpeace in the region and in its global campaigns to make polluters pay. As former Deputy Minister of the Philippines, Yeb has led the negotiations that resulted in the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. I'm going to pause here because that's the end of our introductions to the panel. And please join me in giving a big hand to our panel and welcoming them. Now, let's start from the very beginning of how an NCQG can indeed help unlock NDCs. That's the central purpose of why we're gathered here today. So let's hear perhaps from Kathy to begin with. Kathy, thank you for joining us today, and tell us a little bit about the urgency of the climate crisis, how it's impacting the communities you work with, and how you see NCQGs helping lead to the fossil fuel phase out.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. In the Marshall Islands, we're an atoll nation. For those who aren't aware, we're only 2 meters above sea level, and there's no mountains or higher ground to go to. So obviously that paints a picture of immediate vulnerability. So one of the things that we've been experiencing more frequently are inundations from what we call king tide floodings, which are happening more and more frequently, where water rushes over the land and destroys destroys crops, and then also infrastructure as well. So just this past year alone, we had 4 different atolls that experienced different inundations. It destroyed a lot of infrastructure of schools. It also led to rolling blackouts and even water shortages that we experienced on like almost a weekly basis. So it led to a kind of a cascade of issues and events that made life a lot more difficult for a lot of people on the ground. Besides that, the government has to figure out where we're going to get the budget to help all of these homes that were destroyed. And so there's a lot of internal labor that comes from these impacts on the ground. But the other thing too is I did talk about the National Adaptation Plan, and the plan, although it's just, kind of considered another policy document that an exercise that we do at the international level, for those of us in the Marshalls, focusing inward and learning how to adapt and protect our islands is really an exercise in demonstrating the severity of the issue, that we're now accepting that we're going to have to change the physical landscape of our islands to be able to stay above water and to be able to remain on our islands, basically. So we're looking at hard adaptation solutions that look at land elevation, land reclamation that extends out into the lagoon, and even internal relocation of our community members, because we've accepted that at some extent there is going to be these impacts coming down the line, and that we need to prepare our communities now. And so we've been doing a lot of outreach and advocacy on the ground to get our communities aware of what's about to happen, and that we're going to be making these massive changes changes. And so I think that's a real indication of how severe the issue is that it's not necessarily just, impacts that we're experiencing on the ground, but it's also changing the development of our entire country and also making some hard decisions in terms of land tenure and cultural loss as well. That's something that is an even longer conversation that I'm sure Joe can speak to as well. So I guess for the NCQG, what are we wanting at this COP and how does that help with fossil fuel phase out? I think for us, it's less about what the figure actually is and more so about like greater confidence that the money will come and accessibility at the end of the day. Because I think a lot of us small and developing states are operating on extremely limited budgets, limited capacity, and it's extremely difficult to access these climate finance. So, even just getting GCF accreditation, our Marshall Islands is in the process of getting that right now, and it's taking us quite a bit to get through that. And we'll be getting it in about a year and a half, but it's a long drawn out process basically. So we need to make sure that we're able to access and that it shouldn't take 2 years before we can start applying for a project. So every MDB should be following that same process. So for mitigation, I think we're really in support of stopping funding fossil fuels through trillions in subsidies and in so-called international climate finance and identifying, what isn't climate finance actually. We also want to follow up on the GST's energy goals by closely tracking delivery at the global level and then demanding faster action when we're falling short. So we've heard different groups say that they only need to follow up on finance on GST and that we can trust countries to deliver the fossil fuel transition through their NDCs. But I think for us, there's no evidence that fossil fuel producers will act without external pressure. And so that's a bit of what we're following through with the GST now as well. So that's what these are kind of the things that we're hoping to commit at the at the higher level, and making sure that also that the NCQG is grant-based or highly concessional finance for adaptation and for loss and damage and for Pacific SIDS, because we can't be operating on loans and we need programmatic funding. When you're looking at something as large scale and as long-term planning, such as the National Adaptation Plan, changing an entire island, you can't do piecemeal financing. You need financing that's long-term and allows us to be flexible and adjust as things come up for our country. So these are some of the issues that we're hoping that will come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Kathy, just as a quick follow-up, what exact action would you expect at the end of this week? What would you like to see world leaders?
It's kind of a tough goal. I guess just I would love to see a highly ambitious goal and in ways in which accessibility is provided for SIDS and LDCs in particular, and making sure that it's a goal that is ambitious and also has financing addressing adaptation and loss and damage as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Laurie, it's great to have you here, and I'm hoping you can give us some insight into why this COP particularly, as the finance COP, plays an especially critical role in the climate fight. We often hear skepticism around COPs, and this one is no exception, but what are you seeing as opportunities this time around? And more specifically, could you tell us how you see NCQGs unlocking NDCs to phase out fossil fuels and build the renewable future we want?
Thank you, and also thank you for having me at this event. So last year in Dubai, countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, and that was the first time after 30 years of talking about climate action at these conferences that governments explicitly agreed that we need to phase out fossil fuels. And this is key because fossil fuels are the single largest source of emissions. And despite these 30 years of talking about climate action, these emissions are still on the rise. So the key missing ingredient to turn this promise into action is finance. And this is precisely what countries are discussing at the COP here in Baku. It is really critical that we get grant-based and highly concessional finance, so good quality financing, to make sure that countries are actually enabled to deliver this transition away from fossil fuels and also the build out of renewables, energy efficiency, and can deliver the national climate plans that are due next year that are actually aligned with 1.5 degrees and can phase out fossil fuels. For the climate finance goal to be effective, It needs to provide grants-based financing and also highly concessional financing. And this is important because many of the countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis are in serious debt stress. We know that 93% of the countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis are either at significant debt stress or at risk of being at significant debt stress. So if we continue to provide climate finance largely at loans, this will only worsen the debt levels in these countries and will not allow them the fiscal space that they need to take climate action. So grant-based finance and highly concessional finance is really key. For the climate finance target to deliver, it's also really critical that it contributes to efforts to end fossil fuel finance and fossil fuel subsidies. This is also an opportunity to free up the trillions that we need for climate action. And what we should not see, and I repeat, this is really important that we don't see this in the NCQG, is a recognition that carbon markets or carbon credits can be counted as climate finance, because this is an escape route for the fossil fuel industry that allows them to continue to pollute as long as they offset their pollution. What we are hearing in the negotiations is that the rich countries that owe these trillions in climate finance to the global south, because they have the largest historic emissions and are also continuing to pollute, we hear them say that there is not enough public money to pay for climate action. But we know that this is not true. We have actually run the numbers and have a beautiful fact sheet and also this beautiful leaflet that shows that by ending fossil fuel handouts and making polluters pay and also changing the unfair global financial rules, rich countries can actually free up over $5.3 trillion a year in public finance for climate action and also other public policies. So the excuse that there is not enough money in this world doesn't hold. We know that just the 10 richest individuals on this planet have a combined wealth of over $1.3 trillion. If we were to tax them, we can raise billions, hundreds of billions in public money that we need to address the crisis that we're in. So yeah, the argument that we cannot pay for climate action doesn't hold, and we really need countries to end the harmful finance and free up that finance for the action that we need. And while in the negotiations, there is generally a recognition that grant-based finance and highly concessional finance is really key for loss and damage and adaptation, which it is. We also see many countries claim that private finance can cover the energy transition bill. And this would be a very risky bet, because if we look at where private finance has flowed in the past, it is largely going to rich countries and not to the countries that need the finance most. And it's also not necessarily going the technologies that are key to enable the energy transition. We have also looked at this claim that every dollar of public finance that gets invested in the energy transition will raise $5 to $7 in private finance for the energy transition. And if you look at the finance flows over the last 5 years, you show that shows that that's not the case. $1 in public finance doesn't raise $5 to $7 in private finance, but it raises less than $1 in private finance. And the other concern with this approach is that additional private finance for the energy transition also adds to the already unsustainable debt levels that many of the countries most vulnerable to the climate finance face. So we really need rich countries to step up and meet their obligation to deliver also the public money that is needed for climate action, particularly for loss and damage and adaptation, but also for the just energy transition and other mitigation priorities as well. And there are actually some positive examples that we can build on here. In Glasgow at COP26, an initiative was launched that is called the Clean Energy Transition Partnership that has 41 members, including some of the largest historic financiers of fossil fuels, but also including 15 lower and middle income countries. And under this initiative, countries committed to end their international public finance for fossil fuels and instead fully prioritize their public finance for renewable energy. And this initiative has actually delivered some real world impact. And the signatories have managed to bring down international public finance for fossil fuels by 2/3 or by $15 billion a year. And here at this COP, they also launched a new commitment to work together to deliver more accessible finance for clean energy, targeted particularly at the low-income and emerging economies. Another positive example that I'd like to highlight here is a key opportunity that is right in front of us, not in Baku, but in Paris this week. That's where governments are gathering to discuss a deal that could end $41 billion a year in oil and gas export finance. For a very long time, Biden or the US has been blocking progress on in these negotiations, but over the last week we have seen signals that the US is starting to support a deal to end oil and gas export finance for fossil fuels, and the key remaining blocker at the moment is Korea. So if Korea gets over the line, this could help land a deal there that can again help free up billions for climate finance, which is what is so urgently needed here. And that potential deal already has the support of the EU, the UK, Norway, Australia, and New Zealand. So it's really critical that in addition to the US, Korea also supports this deal so that we can end finance for fossil fuels, because any new investment in new oil and gas production is incompatible with limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. And also because we need this money to be invested in the climate action that we so desperately need to address the severity of this crisis that is already causing deadly storms, floods, and heat waves. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'm sure we'll come back to you with further questions. Thank you, Laurie, for having drawn that very clear line of how the money can help finance the justice element of the transition ahead as well. Bill, I'm going to turn to you next to point us to how we might see renewable energies outgrow and displace fossil fuels, which is, of course, something that we all want. What do you see as the key demands that we should put to world leaders? And particularly keen to hear what red lines we should be pushing. What are the opportunities on the table for countries, Bill?
Great, thanks. And great to see so many people here to discuss this issue. I guess at the heart of your question really is how do we actually achieve a fossil fuel phase out? And I think that's what I wanted to just step through was the kind of issues that countries need to address to do that. Why is a fossil fuel phase out so important? It's because we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees for the reasons that Kathy's mentioned, and it's absolutely critical that we do so. And one of the things we've learned in the climate physics space the last 20 years is that as soon as we get to net zero CO2, we can stop warming, give or take half a decade. And that under the Paris Agreement, we also need to get negative greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of this century. Now, I'm mentioning that because that also means that we would peak warming this century and have it lower, significantly lower by 2100. And people need to keep that in mind because that's the only way that places like the Marshall Islands are going to have any chance of survival. If we fully operationalize the Paris Agreement, then we would significantly lower the likely sea level rise over the next 100, 200, 300 years. So now how do we do that? There's 5 or 6 or 7 interlocking elements that I think are quite important. I'll step through them quickly because that gets to the heart of actually how do we scale up renewables fast enough? Can't just do one thing. The first thing has already been mentioned. We need to stop authorizing and funding fossil fuel expansion. This is happening at scale. Governments are still authorizing fossil fuel expansion at scale and they're funding it. And that has to stop. Otherwise, we'll keep seeing fossil fuels enter the market that will outcompete renewables. The second point, I think, is that we need to see governments work on how to transition away from fossil fuels, for governments, national governments, to develop in their NDCs plans for transitioning away from fossil fuels. Some countries seem to be confused. They think that a transition away from fossil fuels means starting with new oil and gas developments. But there's no confusion on the physics side of it. We really need to see that happen. Third element is to scale up renewables faster. A lot of countries are already scaling up renewables, but relatively few are on a 1.5 degree pathway to do so. And some of the laggards happen to be in the OECD, actually, and some of the most advanced countries happen to be like China or Brazil on a 1.5 degree pathway for renewabilizing their power systems, but for many others, they're way off. Now, there's been massive developments in this area, and that's a really positive thing that's happening out there, and it's already beginning to be seen in the emission curve from the power sector. But massive as it's been, it needs to be a lot bigger and faster. Now, how do you do this? Well, it needs building the enabling frameworks for clean investment. Countries are going to have to invest in their energy systems anyway, and that'll be at scale of trillions a year, really. So we're talking about switching and additional investments, and governments need to build the enabling frameworks. And at the OECD level, we have an enabling framework going in completely the opposite direction. And we also see that through multilateral development banks and national policy level. So that building an enabling framework at the national and multilateral level to make sure investments go into clean as opposed to dirty is going to be one of the fundamental issues, and in particular, to make sure it goes into developing countries. I think 85% of the investment in clean tech in the last few years has gone into the developed countries in China, with only 15% going into the rest of the world, where it's urgently needed. So that's because there isn't an enabling framework. And of course, there are many complicated issues around that. You've mentioned, fiscal space for developing countries, getting into debt by investing. These are solvable problems that I'm hoping may ultimately come out of the NCQG framework that we're discussing here. Fifth, we mentioned already phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. This is an ongoing issue. Year after year, countries agree to phase out fossil fuels with some formulation and nothing happens. Fossil fuel subsidies keep increasing. So that is a really big problem that civil society needs to keep pressure on government on. The sixth point out of 7 I wanted to mention, not exclusive 7, is focus on real zero emissions. There's a very important paper in Nature yesterday from a whole bunch of us in the scientific community pointing out that we can't rely on the land sector or oceans to mop up our fossil fuels. We really have to focus on getting fossil fuel emissions down in absolute and real terms. A lot of governments focus on net zero, which means they offset fossil fuel emissions with voluntary carbon market offsets, with land sector credits at home. This won't work. We will not be able to limit warming to 1.5 degrees if we keep going down that pathway. Now, wrapping all this around, we have our NDCs, our nationally determined contributions, which means they're sovereign. So that means countries need to work on aligning all of these elements I mentioned and others with 1.5 degrees. They have to bring this together in a package. Now, there are some positive examples out there of countries doing that. There's an awful lot that are not. And there are a number of NDC targets that are performative. One example would be the United Arab Emirates 2035 NDC target. Looks great on paper, but I don't know who here can imagine how a country like the UAE can halve its emissions in 5 years. So we don't need to see targets like that. We need to see realistic, investable, ambitious, and implementable NDCs containing these and other elements to have any chance at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees.
Thank you so much, Bill. Clearly, we have our work cut out for us, and these very helpful steps that you've outlined for how the multilateral processes can help us get there, those are invaluable. And I'm going to take a breath and turn to Joe now to bring us a very different element of the climate campaign. When we talk about climate justice, and we talk about bringing a better future ahead of us, we need to be reaching for better wisdom as well. And so, Joe, the indigenous communities that have long held this traditional knowledge and knowing that they can play a critical role in outlining the climate solutions ahead that we so desperately need. From your perspective, how might we integrate Indigenous wisdom into our climate strategies? And particularly keen to hear, and for our guests as well to be made aware of what key obstacles hinder the full recognition and application of this wisdom in our global fight against climate crisis.
Thank you, Namra. Maybe I'll just preface my answer by just being clear that reaching for the wisdom is not reaching towards me. It's maybe reaching toward people like Kathy, because I know nothing. But this statement I know to be true in that Indigenous communities have long held invaluable traditional knowledge that can play a critical role in climate solutions. Traditional knowledge, cultural knowledge, traditional science, stories that connect us to land and sea. These are things that are central to Indigenous peoples, but things that continue to be sidelined in policy and strategy. They are sidelined in the COP process. And it's not for the lack of capacity. Indigenous people don't lack the capacity to contribute to these processes and strategies, but instead, what we constantly find is that these processes lack the capacity to understand traditional knowledge. Here at COP, the Indigenous Caucus has strong positions on all agenda items, and they've been disseminated and spread out through our negotiators and governments, yet still we find in the text the presence of Indigenous peoples and the mention of Indigenous peoples continue to be diminished. So it leads me to ask the question, what are the values that underpin our climate action strategies? Do we value Indigenous knowledge? Do we value Indigenous people? And if we did, why aren't we centering them in our strategies and thinking? And so it's important that we center our values when we are setting these ambitious finance goals or thinking about our NDCs or planning for the rollout of renewable energy, because we risk recreating this oppressive capitalistic structure that the fossil fuel industry has us living under now if we don't. So what are the values that should underpin this process? What are those principles and guardrails that should continue to guide our renewable energy future, and how are Indigenous people centered in the creation of those? Indigenous knowledge shouldn't be integrated into climate strategies. Climate strategies should start with Indigenous knowledge. It should be guided by the values of care and stewardship that Indigenous people have, not the addiction to profit and the hoarding of wealth and resources the global North countries and the fossil fuel industry continue to value. So to answer the question on what hinders this, if we valued Indigenous voices, they wouldn't be sidelined in these negotiations whilst thousands of fossil fuel lobbyists continue to march in year after year. If we valued Indigenous knowledge, the platforms created for Indigenous people that feed into these processes would be honored and uplifted. If we valued Indigenous people, our finance goals and mechanism would be centered in getting finances to the caretakers of our planet in a way that is just, is equitable, is empowering, is fast, and doesn't drive our communities further into debt. If we valued Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous people, Indigenous voices, then these next COP presidencies should make space for Indigenous co-presidents. That way we can ensure that the next negotiations that move on from here are grounded in the values of Indigenous people, and that these negotiations can continue to be centered in that.
Thank you, Joe. That's a very clear, powerful call for the next presidencies as well. Thank you for having outlined that. Yeb, I'm going to come to you now with a question on climate finance. This COP is supposed to deliver on a new finance goal in the trillions. And yet we continue to see rich countries, which have historically been the largest contributors to the climate crisis, backtrack on their responsibilities to provide financial support. From your perspective, give us a bit of hope. What are the most effective strategies with which we can hold the most polluting nations and corporations accountable? And how do we ensure that climate finance truly reaches the communities and investment of solutions that need it the most?
Thank you very much, Namra, and hello to everybody. Wonderful to be among our friends in the panel. Well, first of all, let me unpack this question. For me, the most important part of that question is, how do we ensure that those who need it the most get the money? But first of all, backtracking is really putting it mildly. Rich nations have been perpetuating injustice, and they are time and again breaking promises. And you know, for me as a parent, I don't want to teach my kids to be breaking their promises. And so it's a fundamental basic tenet in life, and we see that over and over again, especially dishonoring those who are impacted the most. allow me to use a metaphor. Someone burns your house down and then offers you a loan for you to build your house again. And while he's building your house, he's lurking around like the fossil fuel lobbyists, thousands of them in this space. Now, let me also clarify, when we talk about NCQG, let us be clear about that. That is financial flows from developed countries to developing countries. And therefore, when we're talking about unlocking NDCs, we're unlocking NDCs in the developing world. And that is crucial. Why? As you would have heard from our friends earlier, and I'm sure Bill would attest to this, how the NDCs, none of the NDCs currently are aligned with the 1.5 Paris goals. Most NDCs, both developed and developing country, are highly inadequate or critically inadequate. And so it's really important for us that when we talk about resources, those who need it the most are receiving the least, and we have to change that. And without significant climate finance, there's no Paris Agreement. Without ambitious climate action, there is no Paris Agreement. So as primary contributors of climate finance, rich nations, sometimes we call them, but developed countries in the jargon of the UNFCCC, they need to take that lead in resourcing this new goal. And I tend to agree with Kathy. It's not so much because the money is there, as Laurie said. There's not an absence of money. There's an absence of political will. There's an absence of government action also to make the fossil fuel industry accountable. So the commitments that rich nations should put forward in resourcing this new goal should not be conditional on the contribution of others. They should not be waiting for NDCs. They should be sending those signals now, but also they should be taking the lead also in the transition. So this said, over 2/3 of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions now come from non-Annex 1 countries, and it is rising by about 3% per year. So decoupling the economic growth of developing countries from emissions is truly very crucial. And that won't happen if we cannot have the NCQG. Let me therefore answer what strategies. I'm not gonna offer the illusion that I would be here to give hope, but I would offer defiant hope. We continue to be defiant despite what's happening, because the NCQG, for us, if it's ambitious and if we have a good outcome at the end of the week, should unlock the rest of the difficult areas, but it should also be a turning point for the fossil fuel industry and other high-emitting sectors to pay for the harm and destruction that their business is causing. So the first order of the day is international binding agreements and the enabling frameworks, as Bill also said. We need that NCQG here. That is important, and that is the best beacon for hope, and that's the best beacon for transformation. I'd like to mention two more things, because the regime for exacting accountability for polluters to pay for climate damage and ensure that those who need the most get it must include a wider range of sources. And it's not just public funding, as we are pushing for in the NCQG, but I would advocate for the creation of a climate damages tax. And this is on the extraction of fossil fuels. This is an excellent example of a new source of finance based on the polluters pay principle. It really has the potential to generate billions of dollars. If the OECD alone does this at a rate of about $5 per ton of carbon equivalent per year, with an increasing rate of $5 per year, by 2030, that could have generated $900 billion. So the idea is that the bulk of this proceeds should go to those who are impacted the most for loss and damage and assisting those countries. Now, however, another part of that, maybe 20% of that, could go into what is called a domestic dividend mechanism. That would go into just transition and assist, workers and the sectors that would be affected in the countries where this tax is imposed. Let me close this initial round by saying, let's consider the reality. Halfway already through this current decade, emissions are continuing to rise, and most governments have wildly inadequate 2030 climate action plans, despite what has been decided in terms of the global stocktake last year that we must cut emissions by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 because we need to get to 2050. In 2050, people who still live in 2050, in the year 2050, will look back on our generation and they will either blame us for our failure or thank us for being ambitious. Thank you.
Thank you, Yeb, and to the whole panel for having outlined where each of you stand on this, and very important reminders to all of us. As I kick off the conversation part of this panel discussion, I want to start perhaps with you, Kathy, and just underlining what Yeb has outlined for us now. If you could, as a reminder, share with us what this lack of adequate climate finance, how it affects developing countries and their ambition. It's something real right now. We've got eyes set on it, on the prize, but I think it's important for us to be reminded of what really is at stake for developing nations.
Yeah, thank you. While we don't think a lack of identified funding is an excuse to lowball ambition, many developing country NDCs do need international support. So even many mitigation activities in small and remote markets like the Marshall Islands, it won't attract private finance. So that's why I do agree with a lot of what has been said previously about how we need to focus on public financing. We were the first to set out a revised and really ambitious NDC back in 2018, but we only received half the money that we needed. And so we haven't been able to upgrade our electricity grid, and that's one of the reasons why we've been having these frequent blackouts. So I definitely think that that's a key part of it is that financing does need to happen. And then last year, like I mentioned, we published our national adaptation plan in Dubai, and we called it our national survival plan. And even the needs for adaptation alone are in the billions, which is why we've been trying to advocate a lot more for adaptation to be in financing to be in line with mitigation. Just to adapt 2 of our urban centers alone would cost $9 billion, which is money that we obviously don't have. And that's for hard infrastructure alone. That's looking at land reclamation, seawalls, and land and land elevation. So so there's a lot more cost that it would add to that number if we're going to take into consideration relocation of community, building houses and settlements in new settlements that the communities would have to be relocated to, health and cultural impacts, those kinds of things. So the cost of implementing our NAP is already in the billions. So we're really keen to talk to countries, implementing agencies, donor entities, and MDBs to leverage that finance. And that's been a lot of our goal at these COPs too, is not just to ensure a really ambitious global goal, but also to look after ourselves and try to find those connections that we need to finance these NAPs. Accessibility challenges to adaptation finance continues to plague us, like many other SIDS. So we've been trying to work to communicate our adaptation priorities through the NAP, but significant challenges remain when it comes to detailed planning, costing. So we've been actually working with other MDBs, like Asian Development Bank has kind of stepped in to sort of help us figure out costings and numbers for more than just hard adaptation, but also the internal restructuring. Because if you're going to be implementing across every single sector, you're going to need to revise in our entire internal government just to be able to to take in all of that financing and to implement at that scale. So I think there's a lot of steps that we're looking at basically, and then to catalyze. But another thing that we've also explored in terms of a locally led approach to deal with some of the complexities of implementation is the creation of something called the MIRA, the Marshall Islands Resilience Adaptation Trust Fund. And it's supposed to be a one-stop shop for donors to provide the financing to. And we created that and developed a policy for it ourselves. And we're not the only ones in the Pacific or even in the SIDS who's done something similar. But the idea is that we have some place that allows us the freedom to implement as necessary, without having to go through all of the hoops and the layers of complexities that some of these grants require of us. And then so I think finally we're looking forward to working with donors and to support the fund and without bureaucracy. But I hope that kind of shows the kind of financial support that we're requiring, and that makes it difficult at the end of the day. And I think I talked pretty extensively about the difficulty with access to with my previous answer. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you also for making it, for making visible to us here how the countries that need to receive the funding are the ones who are carrying the burden of making it easier. Laurie, I'm going to come to you next with a question about where that money needs to come from and what needs to happen at the donor end, without making it sound like these are donors, but how do we get these countries to pay their dues?
Yes, I'd say that these so-called donors are actually the ones that owe a climate finance to the global south. It's the debt that they owe to the global south. And I think that we should all start talking about it that way. I already outlined that there is plenty of money in this world to pay for climate finance. It's just flowing to the wrong things. And it's really key that we end fossil fuel handouts. They still amount to over $1 trillion a year, and government subsidies, public finance for fossil fuels, and also investments by state-owned enterprises. And it's also key that we tax polluters, that we make polluters pay. Currently, we are paying the polluters, and it should be the other way around. It is totally ridiculous that the industries the fossil fuel industry that over the last 10 years has made profits of over 1 trillion a year on average, that we're actually giving them taxpayers' money to prop up their profits. And we should really make these polluters pay so that we can actually pay for the climate action that is needed. And in addition to that, we also need to really address the inequities in our global financial system. The way that our current global financial system is set up is extractive of resources from the global south. I think that Jaap just hit the nail on the head when he said if you put someone's house on fire, or if you burn someone's house down, you're not going to offer them a loan to invest in the repairs that are needed. And that should certainly not be the case with climate finance. We really need grants, not loans. And this is not just a matter of effectiveness in getting the money where it's needed most, but it's also a matter of equity, because indeed the rich countries owe this to the global south. It's not an offer that they're making or a gift. They owe this finance to the global south to make sure that we avert the worst climate scenarios, and also to make sure that countries can adapt and also cover loss and damage costs. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurie. Yeah, but how might we redirect that money? How do we make sure it gets where it actually deserves to be, and make sure that those profits of polluting industries are actually directed to fund the just energy transition, and that they end up really, changing their lives for the communities that we work with?
Thank you, Nama. If I had the magic wand, then maybe all of us won't have to travel to Baku. But redirecting the profits of polluting industries is really, and in order to fund the transition, the just energy transition, it's really a pivotal step towards ensuring that the burden of climate action does not fall disproportionately on those who are most vulnerable. I'd say we go back to the discussion of implementing ways of directly holding them accountable, including windfall profit taxes. And they have windfall profits all the time. And governments can actually introduce windfall taxes on fossil fuel, and especially during periods of unusually high profits. And you hear them all the time announcing record-breaking profits. And the revenue generated from these taxes can really be earmarked. So earmarking is crucial here. And not just when we talk about these other sources of making polluters pay. Even when we are discussing the NCQG, that's why it's important that the public funding element or component of the NCQG is robust, because that is where, countries like the Pacific Islands and my own country, the Philippines, would have a fighting chance of being able to access these funds. Because otherwise, when it becomes a convoluted conversation about investment goals, then who would invest in a faraway, distant island nation? Most of those investments will go to where the markets are. whether it's mitigation, but also it's going to be very difficult to expect much for adaptation because you don't expect a business return on investment for adaptation in general. And the record shows it very clearly that adaptation funding has been dismal despite the rhetoric around increasing adaptation funding. So what I failed to mention earlier is if all of this all together as we engage in the climate negotiations process, or we put together all of these mechanisms, including taxes, does not work, then we're going to go to the courts, litigation. And that's what many organizations are now trying to do. There's more than 2,600 existing or ongoing climate litigation cases, a vast majority of that in a country where most of fossil fuel companies are domiciled. So this is one way of exacting accountability and making sure that their profits are being redirected. But we need to do a lot more work in order for the money to actually flow efficiently and meaningfully to the most impacted and those who are actually already part of this coalition of the willing to leapfrog into the future with clean development.
Thank you, Yeb. Bill, in all of your years of working on climate, have you seen any positive stories of how finance mechanisms have actually worked?
Yeah, I think there are actually. It's obviously a very complex and fraught space, as we know, and I'm not aware of any mechanism that's really worked satisfactorily, but there are bright spots over the years that have led to some positive changes and investments in countries and in technologies. So the bottom line there is I think we can make it work, right? It's not that we've tried everything and it's failed and therefore it's completely impossible to sort. And the Green Climate Fund got off to a bit of a slow start with cumbersome procedures and that really didn't work and didn't deliver for the vulnerable countries. But they've reformed now, and money is really starting to flow through simplified access procedures and so on. So that is happening. The landscape is complicated because there are some countries that may be able to get enough money, but they can't access it because of their own internal limitations. So we do a lot of work in West Africa, and I was there in July and I heard from quite a few ministers about the difficulties that their governments were having getting their own government sorted to take the money that was available, right? And then there's plenty of other cases, maybe more, where there isn't simply enough money available. So if you're thinking about NDC 3 and what countries are doing in the small island state context to come up with more ambitious NDCs, then one of the main bottlenecks we see is simply not enough money available fast enough. So what that boils down to is really big problems, right? So problems being that the country has to keep the lights on, otherwise it's not in government anymore. And while the international community dithers around discussing this and discussing that, then they have to make an investment in an LNG import terminal and gas turbine to keep the lights on, when actually, if money had been more agile, then that could have probably been avoided, right? And I can think of 2 examples recently where that's been the case. And in Africa, I can give you 4 or 5 examples where there's a lock-in happening because the system is simply not agile enough, right? And it's not just a matter of making money available. You also have to enable countries to develop the capacity to absorb the money. So to give you another example, following through, Africa has a massive renewable energy potential, right? Absolutely massive. But look at the investment. It's basically, well, actually, it has improved the last years, and it's improved because of efforts by the international community, but it's far 10, 20 times below what it could be or should be. And one of the main reasons is there's simply not capacity in country. Now, how do you do that? Well, then there needs to be direct granted funds to enable governments to build up that capacity to design and run and get multi-billion-dollar projects. Otherwise, the companies that are capable of pulling that off can't get the scale required to do it. And if they can't, then the renewables too expensive. So I'm just giving a mapping of what's going on. So it's the volume of money is one thing, the governance and ability to roll it out effectively and in an appropriate way for individual countries is another fundamental obstacle to actually making this effective. So the complex landscape of issues there that we are dealing with practically, I think right now we're supporting, I don't know, about 13 countries with their NDC3. So we're seeing a lot of these things firsthand in the Caribbean, in West Africa, East Africa, and South Asia. So it's a fairly general message here.
Thank you. And as Kathy has already talked to us about how, you know, the work being done in some of these countries to make them absorb these funds and investments better and to make it possible to really drive this change off the back of the investments that eventually come through the pipeline. Joe, what will it take to bring the voices of communities into the negotiations at home? Because some of this, as we've heard from others on the panel as well, there's work that gets done here. There are negotiators who are skilled at this, but also there's equally work to be done back home to make sure they're receiving the right inputs and that they're hearing most from those who are most directly impacted. So tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do with the climate warriors to make sure that these voices are directed to influence climate policy back home as well.
Oh, thank you. We're really lucky that in the Pacific, it's not just the mechanisms, but the structures and the culture is there for us to consult with our communities, to have a better understanding of what's happening, to talk to our people and to gather. We're also just storytellers, to be able to gather the stories of our people and to use them within our advocacy and to really learn from all of the things that are happening. And in the context, especially of this conversation around finance and especially climate finance, there is also so much work happening within our region to ensure that there are mechanisms set up and that we are part of that process. Last year, the Pacific Resilience Facility was launched in the Pacific. This year, it was brought to COP with the aim of raising $1.5 billion, 1.5 for 1.5. At the moment, we're at about 500,000 and still 100 million to raise. And that's like a Pacific owned and a Pacific envisioned climate finance facility. A lot of our young people are also working with the Scottish government. 2 years ago, the Scottish government was the first government to launch a loss and damage fund, and those funds have gone directly to communities. And part of that also is George Coombe, which Kathy's youth are part of. And what that looks like now is a lot of our communities telling their experiences of what it's like to access those funds, how they're impacting them, what the process has looked like, with the hope that we can actually build a finance model, a loss and damage finance mechanism model of our own. And those are the kind of things that we need to try and continue to do, is try to involve our people and try to understand the reality that they have when it comes to these contexts. Because when it comes to finance, it's not because we have a lack of capacity to be able to do what we can with the finance. It's because our funders and our donors lack the capacity to understand our context. And so the more we can actually bring our people into these conversations and learn and tell the stories, I think the better. And so that's our job, is just to talk to people, listen to them, create platforms where they can tell their stories and find ways that we can advocate for them and give them everything that they need. And what that amounts in is that you can come to these negotiations and sometimes feel really depressed or defeated that you won't get the outcomes that you want from the overall negotiation. But we know that there is more happening for us in our region. We know that in the smaller rooms, there are conversations like this happening, that these smaller innovative ideas of finance mechanisms are happening. We know that our governments are talking in bilaterals to make sure that the money is coming to us. We know that other things are happening. And so it's really about just building community and people power and knowing that we're all here together. And I didn't even know if I answered that question because I just rambled on there for a second, but yes.
You certainly did, Joe. Thank you so much. It's been a really rich conversation. I've pulled on various elements of each of your experience and expertise. And I'd like to throw it open now to the floor to see if anyone in the audience would like to do the same and ask questions. I see a hand shoot right up, so please. I think the room is small enough for us to be able to hear you without a microphone, but if not, then perhaps we have you come up here.
Yes, thank you so much to the panel. My name is Hannah. I'm from Eco Business. We're a media organization based in Southeast Asia. I spoke to some Philippine CSOs yesterday, and they told me that there are strong indications that countries are going to be accepting a weak NCQG versus no deal at all. I just wanted to ask the panel, especially Mr. Yeb Sanyo, if you could tell us what your thoughts about this, if you know anything about these so-called strong indications that we've heard from yesterday. Thank you.
Shall I respond? Well, thank you, Hannah. There's always strong indications of bad news in every camp, especially on the first 2 days of the second week. But I'd say this is also born out of the state of play right now in the negotiations, where parties engaged in text negotiations last week, and you see there's still 25 pages of about 170 paragraphs in that negotiating text as the week ended. So that does not inspire confidence, especially with the centerpiece of COP29, which is the NCQG. So there's reason to worry about that, whether we have enough time to actually come up with a robust deal. But we can also define what is a bad deal. A bad deal, of course, is something that excludes those who are most vulnerable, therefore excluding loss and damage in the equation. A bad deal would also be one that has a very vague public finance component. A bad deal is one that talks too much about the investment goal. A bad deal would be one that has a very, very low quantum. And therefore, you have many different ways of coming up with a bad deal here. So is that acceptable to us? Obviously, at this stage, that's not acceptable, and we will continue to push for the most ambitious possibility here.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Fiona Ryan from Forest Development and Climate. I've noticed with the NDCs, they keep talking about a 2035 target, whereas the GST, the Global Stocktake, said countries should use the NDC to strengthen their 2030 targets. So there seems to be, there's a lot of, they're trying to kick it down the road another 5 years. UNEP said we need to strengthen the 2030 target to meet the 1.5 degree goal. WRI says that as well. So it seems that the rich countries, the ones I've heard about, Europeans and my own country, Australia, they all talk about 2035 as if 2030 doesn't exist as a GST enhancement option. And I was wondering if anybody wants to mention that.
Thank you. Would like to, Laurie? Yes, go on.
Yeah, I think it's really critical that we see increased ambition for 2030, but I'd also say that there is also things that countries can do right now to actually deliver on reducing emissions. The first most effective thing they can do is to stop investing in fossil fuel expansion. And they need to do so right now, because we know, based on the IEA's research and based on the IPCC reports, that any new investments in new oil, gas, and coal are incompatible with limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. So if we want to get to ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets, we need to stop fossil fuel expansion. That is the first thing that we must do. And on this, actually, this last week, there was a ruling of the appeals court in the Shell climate case that I was working on before I joined OCI. And while the court wasn't able to rule in favor of Milieudefensie and force Shell to adopt a specific emission reduction target for 2030, it did recognize the science that there can be no further investments in oil and gas if we want to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. And it also suggested that there are legal responsibilities that companies have in this regard. So this creates an opening for us potentially to challenge these continued investments. The court wasn't able to rule on this matter because it wasn't part of Milieudefensie's Friends of the Earth Netherlands claims. But the court did suggest that companies may have legal responsibilities in relation to their continued investments in oil and gas. So that is perhaps another kind of beacon of hope for us to focus on in working on holding polluters accountable. Thank you.
Would any of the other panelists like to step in on that? Joe, please.
I think the only thing I'd like to add is that we all have a responsibility to hold our own governments accountable to NDCs. And we shouldn't just be waiting until we're here at COP to hold them to like bring that level of accountability or to make that known. We have to go back and understand what that process is for us, for what is going to be like for us. And it's my understanding that I know that the Climate Change Authority of Australia are going to be releasing their target NDCs in January, and the Australian government are going to go into a federal election. Every opportunity we have from now up until Brazil, we have to hit whatever government we can on the NDCs, ensure that they're setting up really ambitious targets and ensuring that the people of those countries are holding their governments accountable. And I know some really exciting work is happening over the next year. So I hope everybody can join in on it.
Thank you very much. Bill, did you want to come in on that one as well?
Well, look, just quickly, I think that the whole issue of the alignment of NDCs with 1.5 degrees is very active. The fact that some countries are not putting forward new NDCs aligned with 1.5 degrees is indeed a major problem. What I'm hearing from governments that that are not putting up 2030 NDC improvements are they're not getting any pressure from civil society. So I think civil society needs to reflect on that and make sure there is pressure on them. The other thing to really watch out for is what are countries actually doing? Does their NDC match what their policies are? And often policies are falling far short of the NDC targets. And so you can see greenwashing emerging in the sense that a country might put forward an ambitious 2035 target, but be completely unbelievable in being able to achieve that. And I think people in the climate movement need to be paying very, very close attention to that, because that's going to become a bit of a theme, I suspect, as we move towards COP30 next year.
Thank you, Bill. We've heard this now from all of our panelists. So stepping out from my moderator role for a minute and putting on my head of public engagement hat for a moment, I'm just going to stress this one. It is so important for citizens everywhere to be holding their governments to account. It is so important for us to be telling those stories, to be channeling people power through and making sure that governments, corporations, financial institutions, all of these are aware that the pressure is on and that we will find one way or the other to make that demand, to see that demand met as well. So I just felt compelled to jump in here and answer that as well. And now I'll come to you for your question.
So thank you for the sharing. I'm Sikulu from China Newsweek. I also have one question on the NCQG. We all know that in the first week of negotiation on NCQG, one of the key divergences is the scope of finance. And developed countries want a multi-layer provision, including private sector, while a lot of developing countries, of course, including China, insisted that it should be new and additional finance and not include investment. So in terms of how to define provision in this finance mechanism, I'm wondering that for your perspective, could it be possible that we finally reach a consensus on this issue at the end of the COP29, and what kind of result would it be? And back to the discussion, what are the different role of public fund and private money plays to unlock NDCs to ensure the new NDC success? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And looking to our panel here, who wants to jump in on that? Kathy?
The first question, you're just asking how likely it is for private financing to be? I think I might have actually.
So the way I understood the question is whether that private finance could foot some of this bill. How do we make sure public finance?
Because there is a huge divergence between the developed countries and developing countries. My question is, could it possible that we can bridge this gap on this issue, that finally the text of the NCQG is very clarified on that is new and additional finance, and the finance is only public finance instead of also including private sector?
Well, I know that a lot of us in SIDS and LDCs and also the G77 block are pushing for public finance because for some issues that are like adaptation, it's really hard for private financing to go towards adaptation when there's no, returns or, the way that there is on mitigation. So I think for us, the short answer would be no. That's not what we would want. I think we would prefer to keep pushing for public financing and to keep pushing it on an ambition, and despite what we've been told, I think there is enough public financing. Thanks.
Bill?
Look, I think there's no solution space on the NCQG without a substantial increase in public finance. I think that everyone knows that. The question is, what is it going to be? And I think technically there's no solution space for this problem without massive redirection of private finance, private capital, and that needs to be balanced. So, a strong guidance on what the private sector needs to do to invest in clean, as opposed to dirty, could be a very interesting outcome. But without a very substantial increase in public sector finance, direct and mobilized, whatever the jargon is, I can't see a solution space here. You're asking, is a solution possible here? Yes, I believe a solution is possible here. There's a long way to go. I know lots of stories go around about, well, it's looking so bad. There's so many divergences. Well, as Yeb said, it's just Tuesday. And it'll get worse tomorrow night. And it'll be worse on Thursday night. Mm-hmm. And if we leave on Sunday, we'll be very lucky. But I think there is a solution space out there.
Thank you, Laurie.
Yeah, on this, I think it's also really important to remember that many of the countries that have a right to receive this climate finance are heavily indebted. And if they are forced to pay their climate action activities with private finance, this will only serve to increase their debt levels. So that is not particularly helpful. And I'd also say that if we get a very big investment target that doesn't have a strong public core, that's not gonna deliver the investments that we need for a fair energy transition. Also for the energy transition, we need grants to support certain technologies that do not generate profits, and also certain projects that do not necessarily generate profits, such as distributed renewable energy for energy access, but also grid investments. Those really need public financing too. And also some countries are considered too risky for private investments, also for the energy transition. So it's not necessarily true that with mitigation, there is always a chance for profit making, or there is an incentive for private investors to invest. So also there we need public grants if we want to transition fairly. And this is also key to make sure that also the benefits from these investments are in the countries where these investments are made, because with private investments, the returns often flow back to the so-called donor countries and also the companies in those countries as well. So it's not just a matter of equity and responsibility that the rich countries owe public finance, and that they should take their responsibility to deliver public finance for climate action. It's also a matter of actually making this transition happen and making it happen in a fair way. Thanks.
And I'll make one additional point that's only a half joke, which is that if we wanted to look for bridging mechanisms, we should be looking to tax the billions. And that's it, right? If they were to pay a fair tax, that's how you redirect the money from private finance into public finance and then see it invested in the way it needs to be done. Thank you for the question. I see one back there and another one here. So maybe since the mic is with you, we'll go to you and then come to you. Thank you.
Apologies if I jumped the queue. I will. My name's Fiona Beck. I'm an Associate Professor of Engineering at the Australian National University. So my work is on industrial decarbonisation, trying to get the carbon emissions out of the steel making and iron making. And I've spent my COP sitting in a bunch of industry-focused rooms talking about, the economic opportunities of this. And I was really, really struck by what you said, Joseph, about, I want to make sure I get this quote correct, that Indigenous knowledge should not be integrated into climate strategies. Climate strategies should start with Indigenous knowledge. And I'm slightly concerned that we're seeing this green growth. We can grow our way out of climate change with the right technologies. As a technologist, that worries me. I mean, it's just going to be more of the same. How do we get to what Joseph was talking about, really a reorganization of the way that we consume and interact with our planet, away from this idea of, grow at all costs? So, easy question for you. How do we remake the economic system, or at least what are the first steps? Sorry.
Yes, I guess if we could answer that question, we wouldn't be here. But I do know this. One thing I know to be true is that finance is a bridge to climate justice. And so the reality is the skills and the knowledge and everything that exists within Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, they just need to be paid. They just need the finances to flow to their work, rather than people coming in and extracting the information and then trying to make something else out of it. The reality is it's there. The skills and the resources are there. The hard thing for our communities is just accessing the finance in order to be able to build the solutions we know we need. So, yeah, finance.
Bill.
Thanks, Fiona, for that question. That there's no simple answer to the question that you pose, right? So in the rich countries, you can have a good discussion about changing your lifestyles and so on and so forth. And that's necessary and essential, because we know that we can't limit warming to 1.5 degrees without all the efficiency and lifestyle changes that we can start the problem. But in other countries, fast-growing developing countries with large populations, that's not a discussion you can really have. The urgency of getting 750 million people who don't have access to electricity now to get access to get the economic wherewithal to build healthier lives is the primary thing, right? So there's no kind of one size fits all answer to that. The critical thing is to focus on, as economic growth happens in countries, to make sure that it's as clean and as efficient and as closed cycle or circular as possible, right? And there's endless numbers of studies that show that you can't really achieve the Paris Agreement's limits or the Sustainable Development Goals unless you do that. But that still means you're going to have a lot of economic growth, conventionally measured with GDP, in the biggest developing countries for a long time to come.
Thank you, Bill. And as we close off the answer to your question, I also want to center one other phrase that stood out for me in where Joe's speaking, was to think of it not as growth necessarily, but as stewardship of resources. And I think that, that's very powerful as well. If we were to think in those terms, we're looking at a far less extractive scenario. Thank you. I'll take your question. Oh, I'm sorry. We passed it just in the interest of fairness. You ceded the space once.
Thanks. Thais Galar, I'm a journalist from Climatica. And my question maybe is a little more in detail about energy transition and the next round of NDCs. Like, what do we expect, or what is necessary to see in the next rounds of plans in terms of mitigation of the impacts of the energy transitions in jobs and the need of investments in capacity or skills for workers? Thank you.
Looking to our panel to see. So could you remind me of your name? I heard your...
It's difficult even in my country. Thais.
Thais.
Yeah.
Thais, your question is about how the investments need to be structured. Did I catch that correctly? Yes. Ah,
Should we see something also on that in terms of more ambitious on the NDC, like how they are going like to deal, like for example, in countries, if they're going to close like oil production, like
so the labor rights.
yeah,
and
on
job
labor
security.
rights and investment also in maybe new skills or on capacities or workers.
Thank you. I'm looking to the panel to see if anyone's keen to step into that area.
I can have a go, but I'd love for others to jump in on this one as well. Yeah, I think it's clear that there are no 1.5 degree aligned NDCs without a commitment to end new investments in fossil fuels and also phase out fossil fuels in line with 1.5 degrees. But our current world is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Many countries are heavily dependent on revenues from fossil fuels, and also many people are dependent on fossil fuels for their own income. Many communities are as well. And so we really need to see countries develop strong just transition plans to support people and communities and through the transition. We also need a dedicated just transition support flowing to the countries that are currently most dependent on fossil fuels if we want to make that transition happen in a fair way. In the last text that we've seen on the NCQG, and we'll have to see what's going to happen in the negotiations in the coming days, but there have been references to the need for support for a just transition, and it's really important that that is part of the climate finance goal to make sure that this transition isn't done in a way that is at the expense of people and communities, and that people are brought along in this transition.
Yeah, I think some experiences on just transition are interesting. I mean, as you know, the Paris Agreement has a just transition work program effectively, and it's under negotiation here. Whether it survives the next 72 hours is hard to say, but it's there. The challenge is to make sure that there's finance available for just transition in different countries. It's at different scales and different ways. When you look at countries' transitions to a low carbon 1.5 degree energy system, in most cases, there's a net increase in jobs, not all. There's a few examples I can think of where that outcome is ambiguous. Like a very coal dependent economy like South Africa is quite ambiguous. But the thing is, you need substantial resources to go into that. So that means international resources, and you need the national governments to be able to set up the enabling environment or framework to pull that off. Because the international community can provide money, but unless the national government's prepared to operationalize it, then it won't work. And I know of examples like that as well. So I think that's something that you need to look at very carefully at the national level. And if you're thinking about the big questions of like, how do we help India transition to a 1.5 degree pathway? And you think of the enormous number of jobs on the railroads of India, which carry coal, and the coal mining jobs in India, it's a very big challenge, right? So in industrialized countries, there often are well-established frameworks to handle this, and they've worked, better or for worse, actually not perfect in the United States, actually, but in other places they've worked. So I think that's something to really focus on at the national level. And when your countries are putting in NDCs, to make sure they flag the need for finance for that. So that should be built into an NDC that my country needs support for transition in these sectors, right? And you know all the things I'm sure that are needed in this space to make it work. So I think it's so important to have that focus on finance in this area, otherwise it won't happen.
Yep.
Yeah, I just want to add that Bill talked about where the money would come from, because that's really important. There is enough money in the fossil fuel industry, and they do a lot of lip service to the transition. They talk a lot about investing in renewables, but sometimes it's even less than 1% of their total portfolio. So they need to be serious about what they say and put their money where their mouths are, and support just transition, including formulating corporate transition plans and dividend redistribution, having all of this workforce transition support if they're really serious about that. And that will necessarily start from the industry, because if they don't do that, as my friends have already said, if the private sector does not redirect those resources towards the transition, then it would be very difficult for the public sector to make any dent around that.
Thank you. Yeah, and Thais, I just also looked up while I was listening. Unison has just made a statement earlier this week, one of the biggest trade unions in the UK. So Unison has already made a statement that they're fully behind a just and finance shift from fossil fuels to clean energy as a necessity. So perhaps that's something for you to explore, because that is, of course, a very important consideration, what you raise. So thank you. We had a question there. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm a PhD researcher in the Netherlands working on voluntary climate action. And I was wondering, like, we have talked about how NDCs are not ambitious enough and how there's uncertainty regarding the outcome of the NCQG. And I was wondering what role or potential do you see for subnational and non-state actors in maybe mobilizing finance for adaptation in the most vulnerable countries, but also to transition again away from fossil fuels.
So the role of non-state actors in mobilizing finance. For a panel that's been thinking very much about how public finance needs to be directed, that's something of a provocative question, but I see Bill ready to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, the question is complicated, right? Not just finance, but also leading edge action that prompts, for example, a phase out of fossil fuels, right? So, yeah, and I think there are some really good examples of subnational actors, like who've actually moved forward with doing stuff different levels that's made a big difference. And, you know, given the situation in the United States now, we may well have to rely on subnational actors like California and so on to keep pushing forward with their stuff against fossil fuels and electric vehicles and so on. So that's historically been a leading edge tool, actually, for the whole process to move forward. I think that's something to really reflect on. The contribution of subnational actors to climate finance has been pretty small, to my knowledge, not zero. Remember, during the previous incarnation of Mr. Trump, California did step up and make small contributions here and there around the world, but it was difficult to get through that legislature, right? So there were all sorts of issues there, but it's worth thinking about, worth mobilizing on, and particularly helping to put pressure on federal governments. So progressive subnational entities, states within a federation can really help to embarrass or cajole or encourage federal governments who represent their nations at these bodies to do more and better. And there's plenty of really good examples like that. So really worth thinking about how that would work.
I like how you bridged that question, Bill. Any other questions? I appreciate we have about 3 or 4 minutes before we need to clear the room. Any last? Yes, please.
Thank you, Hyun from Green Environment News Korea. So I have a question for Laurie regarding on South Korea's blocking public fossil fuel finance. How much it impacts other countries around the world for South Korea's actions, what they're doing at the moment? Because I think we've earned the fossil fuel of the day yesterday just because of this. And I can't find any statement from South Korea itself. So how much it impacts around the world in collecting climate finance in general for South Korea's action making like this?
Yeah, so this is in relation to also the role of Korea in the discussions at the OECD, right? On international public finance flows. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, at the OECD in Paris, currently negotiations are ongoing on a deal that would potentially end $41 billion a year in export finance for oil and gas. And Korea has a key role to play here because it is actually the largest international public financier of fossil fuels globally. that hasn't yet committed to end this financing. So Canada is the country that has the largest international public finance flows for fossil fuels, but it has already committed to end these, and it has started to bring down this fossil fuel finance. And so Korea was the second largest and is now the largest without any commitment to end this finance. And Canada is also already on board to get this deal in Paris, and Korea is not. And during New York Climate Week in September, there was a piece in Bloomberg that covered the blocking role of Korea, now we are trying to understand what the role is of Korea in the negotiations in Paris, but from the signals that we're getting with the US getting on board, it looks like Korea is the main remaining blocker. And in regards to the impacts that this has around the world, so this deal is about international public finance flows. So it's about the finance that the Korean Export Credit Agency provides to oil and gas projects overseas. Korea is one of the largest financiers of LNG ship carriers, I believe it holds 80% of the global ship carrier building market. So if Korea was actually to end these investments in building new LNG ship carriers, and we know from the science that we also don't need more investments in those LNG ship carriers, then and that actually the market is already oversupplied and significantly so, then this would be good for the climate. It's essential for the climate. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to close us here as I've been pointed out the clock a few times now. Thank you all ever so much. And join me, please, in thanking our wonderful panel. Much appreciation for all of you. And we encourage you to